Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Mr. Buckley, I've noticed that whenever you appear on television, you're always seated. Does this mean you can't think on your feet?
It's very hard to stand up carrying the weight of what I know.
Without Bill Buckley, no National Review. Without National Review, no Goldwater nomination.
We now return to Pullman Way.
Without the Goldwater nomination, no conservative takeover of the Republican Party. Without that, no Reagan. Without Reagan, no victory in the Cold War.
Tear down this wall.
Therefore, Bill Buckley won the Cold War.
So Bill would be delighted about some of the victories the right has scored against the left recently.
DEI is seemingly dead.
Illegal border crossings have sunk to the lowest level in at least 25 years.
Standing athwart history, yelling stop means almost exactly the same thing it did 70 years ago. There were these big forces that thought they were righteous, that thought they were on the march. We are here to say no, there's a better set of ideas that we will defend in advance no matter what.
Conservatism has this reputation that it doesn't have a fighting spirit, but I think National Review goes on the offense all the time.
They took a misdemeanor and they bootstrapped it up to 34 felonies and wanted to sentence him to jail for it. I'm not a huge Trump guy, but this I think is absurd and wrong.
The libertarian philosophy, the small government philosophy.
The National Review was obsessed with the trans insanity long before it was cool.
Do you remember the sister soldier phrase? Bill Clinton's sister soldier moment.
They can't even define what a sister or a woman is. Have a sister soldier moment.
That's right.
National Review made conservatism more coherent.
That prosecution was play acting. They tried to get rid of the Hunter case. They tried to make it disappear.
It's something that is in the DNA of National Review and always has been.
Because if you would, I'd smash you in the goddamn face.
If you're going to fight effectively, it's extremely important to know why you believe what you believe and have the best reasons to take out in the marketplace.
What we must do in order to counter that assault on the American hegemony.
This is a really odd, weird, bad spot to be in for Democrats.
If the booms and busts of business is what we come to expect, why is the government immune from that?
National Review's foray into news coverage, there are some stories, if we don't cover them, just don't get covered.
As a result of my National Review expose, that male predator was moved out.
I got a tip that the very prestigious high school in Fairfax County, the people running it were giving their intellectual property, sharing it with China, which is not what you expect from your average Northern Virginia high school.
It is entertaining and smart and relevant and sometimes funny.
This is my favorite picture of William F. Buckley Jr. He's sitting at the famed El Morocco nightclub with none other than supermodel Bridget Bardot. National Review has always been a part of the culture. And I'm so excited about this next era.
And so you always have to be in that fight, because it's only after you've won that you know how it was resolved.
We vaporize instantly tomorrow. No one would think of starting an intellectually serious publication not interested in clickbait and willing to stand up and tell the truth no matter what. We are stubborn in defense of our ideas and will speak the truth no matter who does or doesn't like it.
Please welcome National Review Editor-in-Chief, Rich Lowry.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 2025 Ideas Summit. Before I do anything else, I want to thank the tireless Aaron Rappa and the entire National Review Institute team for putting on and planning these wonderful couple of days. Thank you so much, everyone. A brief programming note, we're admirably bipartisan, but Chuck Schumer will not be joining us today. He is too busy becoming an object of hate for every Democrat in the country. If only Brett Kavanaugh had been available to warn him to watch what he said and did, or he'd reap the whirlwind. I don't know if everyone is aware of our institutional pace on these events. We have an Idea Summit one year, and then we have regional seminars around the country the next year. So we haven't yet come up with our schedule for the regional seminars next year, but we are considering such fine American cities as Chicago, Dallas, Los Angeles, Calgary, Ottawa, and of course, that great northern metropolis, Nuuk. I've never been to Greenland. I hear that Nuuk is beautiful, not necessarily this time of year, but one day in August for about 6 hours. By the way, we're going to be honored to be joined the next couple days by what I consider the foremost advocate in the country of seizing Greenland by force, our own Michael Brendan Doherty. If the balloon goes up, I have a feeling we're going to have to embed MBD with the 101st Airborne as it takes Greenland. So we are, of course, gathered here on the centenary of Bill Buckley's birth, and it was his audacious project to create a magazine that would embody and revivify the ideas that have made America great. Now, this project was occasionally rocky. At the very beginning, National Review acquired an old townhouse in Murray Hill in New York City to be our headquarters. Now, this was not meant to be a commercial space. It was an incredibly Baroque place. You had to go through about 4 doors to get anywhere. And right at the outset, Bill had an efficiency expert come and look at this building and make recommendations. And the one definite finding he came back with was that it would be totally impossible for a magazine to be produced in that space. Yet it happened. And no matter how much you think that our current times are unprecedented, National Review institutionally has basically been through it before. Contentions over a Republican president, well, Whittaker Chambers and James Burnham wanted National Review at the outset to endorse Dwight Eisenhower. Others thought it would be a rank betrayal. Arguments over the status of the Panama Canal. Bill Buckley and Ronald Reagan famously had their debate over the status of the Panama Canal. Reagan wanted to keep it, and after this debate, later, he had Bill to a dinner at his house and gave very specific instructions for Bill to make sure the headlights of the car were on as he was driving up the long driveway, because Reagan had placed Burma shave-style signs along the length of the driveway reading, "We built it, we paid for it, it's ours." And he might have added, in retrospect, a couple more signs and saying, oh, and by the way, there'll be another Republican president 45 years from now who'll be obsessed with taking it back. The tension between classical liberalism and populism, too, has always been there. Bill famously said he'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston phone book than the faculty of Harvard, although he didn't exactly have common tastes. His friend Ira Glasser of the New York Civil Liberties Union once invited him to a baseball game, and Bill said, "No thanks, I've already been to one." Given Bill's accent and his high-flying lifestyle, his son Chris Buckley once said that it wasn't until high school that he fully realized that his family was American. Now, in honoring Bill, there's a certain former presidential candidate who, if she were here, would be shocked and appalled by how burdened we are by what has been. But Bill's principles, our ideas, they aren't preserved in a dusty crypt somewhere, like a scene out of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, nor are they simply to be displayed on a mantle like a finely polished antique barometer. We honor these principles and ideas and advance them because they are active elements changing our world as we speak. If you take, for instance, a society that is open to talent, a market that rewards inspired innovation, and a national culture that celebrates the independent-minded rogue from Huck Finn to Ferris Bueller, well then, almost as a matter of mathematics, you get Elon Musk. Now, put aside Doge, put aside Tesla, because apparently no one likes cars that are going to save the planet anymore. Put aside even his heroic personal efforts to address the fertility crisis in America. You do all that, and still, his contribution just with his rockets is a totally transformative and is a boon to our position in the space race with China. In our society, it routinely happens that private individuals become national assets. And we honor and advance these ideas because they are the product of centuries of initiative, thought, blood, and toil in Anglo-America to constrain the king, to govern ourselves by consent, to establish the rule of law, to write down how we are to be governed, and ultimately to create what Winston Churchill called the Great Republic. Our ideas are anchored in those honored dates that march through our collective history in 1215, in 1688, in 1776, in 1789, and in 1865. These ideas have been tested and forged in opposition to the likes of King John, King James II, King George, and Woodrow Wilson. And we honor these principles and ideas and advance them because they are profoundly, fundamentally American as a Conestoga wagon or a Winchester rifle, as American as Babe Ruth's swing or a Norman Rockwell painting. Now, I didn't do much sailing with Bill Buckley. In fact, the one time I went out with him on one of his famous evening sails on Long Island Sound, for some reason that evening the anchor didn't take, the tide went out, and we ended up stranded about 25 yards inland at a 45-degree angle all night. But Bill did not write a book about this sail. Now, I didn't say anything, of course, but he didn't invite me again because I think he intuited I didn't have the best time. And as someone who prefers hot showers and flat beds, I'm very picky that way. I didn't have the best of times. But those who did sail with Bill constantly, like his son Christopher, attest that he would go out no matter what. A nor'easter could come roaring in and create harrowing conditions, and he'd go out for his accustomed Friday night sail and always make it back. In a similar fashion, I'd say our little skiff at National Review is built to endure no matter what the weather, because it is hitched to the greatest cause in world history, This nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Maybe centuries from now, the Statue of Liberty one day will indeed be forgotten and sunk to her neck in sand, or some Frenchman will come and take it back. And there will be some other better country. But there hasn't been one yet. And so it is that we sally forth once again, and as always, with gratitude and commitment to the truth as we know it. Thank you very much. So after that stirring introduction, we're going to have a conversation right at the beginning here with Matt Continetti and Charles Kesler. A couple programming notes. There are note cards on your table. If you have questions, we hope you do, scribble them down. Someone will grab them, and we'll get to as many as we can towards the end of our session. There's also a QR code on your table. You scan it, you can see the whole program, bios, other helpful information. And I need to thank Dale and Wendy Brought, our wonderful friends. They're so committed to National Review, for sponsoring this session. And with that, please welcome Matt Continetti and Charles Kesler. All right, so I don't think either Matt or Charles need much introduction with this crowd, but Charles, among other things, is the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and Matt, among other things, is the director of domestic policy at the American Enterprise Institute. And Matt, I'll start with you. Just a big question. We're talking about the state of conservatism. We're going to have a political panel immediately following this one, so we're not going to talk about politics, but that obviously intersects with the state of conservatism. And I have to say, it's a little mixed. This probably goes too far, but a friend reminded me not too long ago of this joke Reagan used to tell about Brezhnev. He said Brezhnev was asked once, how would you describe the state of the Soviet economy in one word? And Brezhnev said, good. And then the interviewer said, well, how would you describe it if you had more than one word? He said, not good. So I think that goes too far in terms of where we are, but it is a mixed picture. And what do you think is the big picture, Matt?
Well, thank you, Rich, and thank you all for attending this event. It's great to see the turnout here. I mean, at first blush, we're on day 58 of the golden age, so I would say everything is going great. But on closer inspection, I'd say there are three ways of looking at this problem. I'll just talk about them very briefly to start. I mean, the first is to assess the strength of the Republican Party. And I know there will be a different panel on politics, but just briefly, the Republican Party is in the best shape it's been in a century. When you think about the fact that not only did President Trump get reelected with a Republican-controlled House, when you think about the number of states that have unified Republican control, when you think about the fact that for the first time since the New Deal, since the 1932 election, the American electorate was majority Republican in 2024, and that continues in some of these polls that we're seeing today. The most recent NBC poll, the most recent CNN poll, the most recent Fox News poll, all had Republican-lean electorate. And that, of course, has been, I think, buttressing President Trump's approval rating. So just at the sheer political strength, the GOP is in the best shape it's been in quite some time. And I think that's an often ignored story. The second way to think of this question is to assess the health of the conservative agenda. And here I think that the conservative agenda is going extremely well, especially on the state level. I just did a little bit of research. As of today, when we meet, 29 states have some form of educational freedom. This is a massive achievement for the conservatives. Some 19 states have banned or limited the practice of abortion. This has been central to conservative identity for half a century. Concealed carry, open carry, dozens and dozens of states have relaxed their gun laws, partly on the basis of Supreme Court decision, others on the basis of state legislation. Gun rights, extremely important to the conservative movement for many years. Only 8 states have no income tax, so there's always room for improvement. But there too, I think on the fiscal level, at the state level, you see great improvement. And in the Supreme Court, the past couple years, not only had the Dobbs decision, not only had the affirmative action decisions, also overruled the Chevron deference precedent, now limiting the administrative state. You can see multiple decisions that the Supreme Court has made that has furthered the conservative agenda that we have known and thought about for so long. So that leaves the final way of looking at this question, and that's the conservative movement. And this is the most, I think, difficult thing to assess, because conservatism has expanded to beyond its limits of what we thought of as the movement for much of the past 50 years. But I would say this, I'm interested in 2 aspects in particular. One is the youth. Poll after poll is showing that this rising generation, the younger Gen Zs, the older Gen Alphas, are the most conservative generation in decades, much more conservative than the millennials and the older Gen Zs. So they too have shifted to the right. When you look at the youth vote in the past election, the way in which it has surged toward Trump and the Republican Party, that is a reassuring sign. Now, I think it's important to remember that conservatism has always been a youth movement. Whether it was Young Americans for Freedom, whether it was the Reaganauts, or whether it's the young people who are coming into the movement today, young people drive this movement. And so that's important to note. Just a side note on that too, I think it's important to realize that this younger generation places a higher degree of emphasis on culture than on economics and national security, which were the primary areas of emphasis for earlier generations of conservatives. And then finally, I'm fascinated by the global aspect of conservatism in recent years. You know, the tech lords who are now a part of this Trump coalition always talk about scale. That's the question they ask. Does it scale? And the biggest scale is global. And I think conservatism, MAGA, has scaled. And so when you look at the extent of these movements in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, even beginning in Africa, you see the next chapter of the conservative story, one that's different than the earlier chapters, but one that I think that is very exciting as well.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Rich. It's a great pleasure to be here. Gerald Ford, the late lamented Gerald Ford, once said of a luminary, if he were alive today, he'd be spinning in his grave. I think if Bill Buckley were alive today, he'd be very excited. As Matt has outlined very intelligently, this is a great age for conservatism. It is not an age without controversy, but it is an age that has had to grasp with part of the agenda which was never really within the reach of the Reagan administration or the Reagan movement. That is, once you had won the Cold War, once you had moved beyond the Cold War framework, both of international relations and, of course, of the domestic political arrangements, suddenly you faced the very difficult question, what to do about the administrative state, what to do about big government, as it used to be called. How does one reassert popular control, democratic control, Republican control, constitutional control over this vast domestic apparatus which had grown up more or less in opposition to traditional American politics and traditional American constitutionalism. The Trump administration is the first Republican administration to have to grapple with that issue. And the the velocity with which they have moved in the first couple of months of the administration and the purposefulness they have shown, I think, has been very eye-opening, not only to conservatives, but to American citizens in general. The scope of the problem is more visible now than it has ever been, thanks in part to President Trump and to the Doge operation of Mr. Musk. And we are sort of entering a period where we can now attack the constitutional questions which had to be postponed during the Cold War. We had, first of all, the most urgent task was to prevent nuclear annihilation of the United States in a hot war, and the only way to do that was to eventually win the Cold War. But the Cold War, as I intimated, was not merely a foreign policy problem. Marxism, communism, our opponent in the Cold War had a domestic agenda too. What we now call woke is, in a sense, the philosophical implications of the Marxist anthropology, the Marxist account of human nature. The attack on the distinction between male and female, the attack on the family, the attack on traditional society, the attack on religion is all an implication, really, of the Marxist philosophy of man, of human beings.
So Charles, can you explain that a little bit more? So the Marxists do not like any of these things. They have this fundamentally materialistic worldview, and that hooks into the woke opposition to such things?
Yes, Marx has a moral or immoral agenda. It has a hostility to the family, to religion, to civil society, to privacy, to private property, all those things we sort of know. But until the Soviet Union had declined, those issues were not at the top of the agenda. And now they have come to the top. To put it differently, the left got used in the 70s and 80s and 90s to running America's universities like its private fiefdom. And in the university setting, the left is almost all powerful. It has such a majority among the professoriate and among the administrative class at our universities that it grew used to its power and to its prerogatives. And essentially what has happened with woke, I think, is that the academic left has exited the academy or the campus and wants to run the rest of the country the way it has run American universities, with a kind of totalitarian dominance and glee. And of course, the conservative movement and President Trump among its leading figures have stood against this expansion of campus totalitarianism to the country at large.
So, Matt, you spoke at the end of your remarks, or noted at the end of your remarks, that this has become an international phenomenon. And certainly in Europe, if you're going to cite one lowest common denominator that has catalyzed this new version of conservatism, or this new movement, it would be immigration, which I've been surprised by many things the last 10 years, but one of them, I've been an immigration hawk. National Review has been hawkish and restrictionist on immigration for a very long time now, but I always thought it would be a secondary issue, and I was skeptical that Trump would actually be able to make it a primary issue. I don't know whether he quite did that in 2016. It was obviously a major issue, but with a lot of help, Joe Biden's negligence and malevolence at the border, it was a top issue this time.
Right, and I think in Trump's first term, you can thank Angela Merkel for making immigration a key issue in contemporary politics. I think two things. I mean, in 2016, Trump, I think, very cleverly paired immigration with the realities and dangers of Islamic terrorism and ISIS. And so he was able to connect those two issues in the public mind very effectively. Then, as you say, 8 years later, he was able to campaign on Biden's open border. We now have the highest percentage of foreign-born living in America ever, even larger than the wave at the turn of the 20th century that led to the immigration restrictions of the 1920s. So immigration has become a key issue, and you're right, it is something that scales because this mass movement from the countries that we would call the global south and is happening everywhere. It's happening in the developed world. It's happening in whether it's Europe or the United States. There's another factor at work too, I think, that's adding to conservatives' changing and growing appeal, and it ties into what Charles was talking about with the university. When I was running the Washington Free Beacon, I would start getting these interns from colleges, and they were a different sort of conservative than I was. I was born at the end of the Cold War. I witnessed those events, and then I was a 90s baby, and that's when I came of age. That was the type of conservatism I inhabited. But for the younger people who started showing up in my offices around 2014, they were being shaped by, I think it's fair to say, the almost totalitarian environment of some of these campuses. And they were rebelling against the politically correct ideas that were being forced down their throats. And as we know now, it wasn't just in college. This generation had been receiving this type of indoctrination in K through 12. That was one of the great revelations of the pandemic, when parents looked on the Zoom on remote schooling and were completely horrified at what their children were being taught at a very young age. And so the natural instinct, I think, of every generation is to rebel against the prior one. And in this case, these young people are rebelling against a generation that has gone very much to the left on these cultural issues. And particularly, the higher credentialed you are, I won't say educated. We have a lot of people with high degrees who aren't very well educated. But the higher credentialed you are, the more left you become. And this split is also happening across the developed world, and it's providing conservatives here with many allies abroad. I don't want to paint a completely rosy picture, though. I do want to mention 3 issues that I think conservatives need to pay close attention to. The first is our national debt. I think Charles is right that conservatives are doing a good job focusing on reconstitutionalizing government. But we have $36 trillion plus of debt. We have multi-trillion-dollar deficits. Service on the debt is now the highest budget line in the federal budget. It outpaced our defense expenditure last year. This is a major problem that ought to be of concern to conservatives. Relatedly, entitlements. I know it's not kosher to talk about entitlements in the Republican Party today, but as conservatives, we can point out that our entitlement programs, Medicare in particular, are out of control and need to be reformed. And that includes Medicaid, by the way, which is, I'm sure, going to be a topic of debate. And then finally, our national security. It's striking to me as a historian of the conservative movement how important foreign policy has always been to conservative identity. And Charles mentioned that in terms of the Soviet threat and the global communist threat. But even though the Soviet Union is gone, there are many threats that remain. And America's deterrent, I think, has been weakened through poor policy choices during the Obama and Biden administration. And so these are the 3 areas that I think conservatives need to concentrate on, in addition to the busy work of limiting the federal workforce and reconstitutionalizing the way that we view the separation of powers and the government.
So what you say about the kind of kids he began getting at the Free Beacon back in 2014, it reminds me of how we focus on George Floyd as sort of the catalyzing event for the insanity of our national life that we're still recovering from. But you could argue the inflection point, and this goes to Charles' point, that it started in the academy and then jumped the walls, but was that Halloween costume controversy. Yeah. What year was that?
I think it was 2014 or 15. Ferguson was 2014, and that led to that, I don't know if you all remember the viral video of the Mizzou professor, this petite little woman, saying we need some muscle over here to crack down on the conservatives. And then the Yale incident. Yes, it was prior to George Floyd. In many ways, Floyd was a culmination in a revolutionary moment that created the conditions for the counter-revolution that we're living through right now.
And what you say, the distinction you make between being credentialed and educated is a very important one. Some of us who've come up the ranks of National Review, starting as the letters editor, noticed that it wasn't always the case, but a pretty good sign that if a letter was crazy, it was going to be signed with someone with a PhD at the end of the name. So, Charles, how do you think about populism? This is a part of the contention over the state of the right at the moment. It's been a contention within conservatism for a very long time. If you ask Bill Rusher, is populism a healthy and necessary thing for conservatism, American conservatism? Absolutely, right? You ask Bill Buckley, it might be more modulated. A populist politician, you put aside the segregationism, but George Wallace, who Bill opposed for all sorts of other reasons besides the segregationism, the crudity, the populist economics. So is populism healthy and a necessary ingredient to American conservatism?
Well, populism is one of those shape-shifting words. Usually it's a term of disapproval. If someone calls you a populist, they're not being polite or friendly to you, they're being critical.
That's why I only call you a populist behind your back.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that. But I don't call myself a populist, and I don't think, oddly enough, Donald Trump calls himself a populist. That's a word he doesn't use, at least in my experience of him.
Common sense is how he'll...
He calls himself a common sense conservative. He has called himself a nationalist. But never, I think, a populist. Populist raises questions about constitutionalism in America because the will of the people is not the highest law simply. The will of the people as expressed in the Constitution is the highest law within our framework, our political framework here. And so we have moral and political counterclaims to make simply to anyone who says that whatever 50% plus one of the people want is by definition right. That has never been a conservative position. It was never Bill Buckley's position. Very astutely, he said, as you quoted him, saying he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than by the faculty of Harvard, which is a couple of thousand people too. But he didn't say the first 20 names or the first 200 names, but 2,000 names. So even when he was being, you might say, democratic or populist, to use the term that we're discussing, he gave himself a margin of error, a margin of safety there. You have to persuade, 2,000 people is not a minuscule amount. But I do think that the conservative movement, as we're discussing it here, is popular, but it's not necessarily populist, I think, in its current mode. It has, as Mr. Continetti was reminding us, it's had an enormous triumph in the 2024 election. It's been able to, and that has enabled it to do things under President Trump that even President Reagan was not able to do. For example, abolishing the affirmative action, the origins of affirmative action in the initial executive order from LBJ.
Which apparently they considered the first time around and thought it'd be too radioactive, and did it this time because they've done so much, it basically hasn't been a debate.
No, exactly. And so there's something admirable about the ambition of this administration and of the conservative movement in its present phase, I'd say.
Something just briefly on populism. I always take the definition of my old friend Jeffrey Bell, the Republican consultant and the man who upset Clifford Case in the Republican primary in '78 on the basis of a supply-side agenda. Jeff Bell wrote a wonderful book called Populism versus Elitism in the early 1990s. And the way that Jeff defined populism was skepticism toward elites. And I think we could substitute expert for elite. And by that definition, I do believe today's conservative movement is populist. There is a great deal of skepticism in our movement about self-described experts, whether that has to do with the way our foreign policy has been conducted, or whether that has to do with the inflationary aspects or supposed inflationary aspects of the Trump economic agenda, or whether that has to do with 51 national security officials saying that the Hunter Biden laptop is Russian disinformation. Or, of course, as we see in a new element in this Republican coalition, Maha and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a great deal of skepticism toward the medical and scientific establishments. So I think if we just see populism as a skepticism or even opposition to the people who basically have determined what is right in public opinion for many decades, then not only is the conservative movement today very populist, but as Charles said, there's always been a populist undercurrent because we are the ones who said in the middle of the 1950s, we're going to stand athwart history, yelling stop. And the late Stan Evans wrote a book in the 1960s that I love called The Fringe on the Top. And the point of this book was that liberals are always calling us the fringe. We're the extremists, we're the radicals. But what Stan did in that book, again in the early 1960s, is to say, have you all ever looked at what you think, right? Have you ever thought about what your premises are? And just think about how that applies to a left that's telling us that there are innumerable genders today, that you need to be defined by the color of your skin, that Hamas is a force of resistance and not genocide in the Middle East. I think that skepticism is a healthy attitude, though it can sometimes get ahead of its skis.
So also the limited government tendency in conservatism that has been somewhat subordinated in Trump's rise is still present in the form of this anti-elitism, right? So it's a little less we just need to cut government for the sake of freedom. We need to destroy the administrative state because there are these elites who are fringy and hate us. So with
that might be common sense too, in opposing elites that are phony elites, essentially fake elites. I mean, Bill always made the point that you couldn't have expertness unless there was an expertise in the field. Yeah. I mean, and in many fields in the university, needless to say, there is really no expertise because there is no body of knowledge relating to the beautification of cities or any of the transcendence of male-female distinctions and many of the agenda items of the contemporary left. They're just they are fantasy items. They're not they're not grounded in the academy in any real sense or historical sense.
Though Dr. Jill Biden would no doubt disagree with that.
Yes, case in point, exactly.
All right, let's see. I believe we have a few questions.
Yes, Rich, we have our first question from the audience. Who do you see is the leader of the modern conservative American movement?
It's Donald Trump. He's the leader of the movement. He's the leader of the Republican Party. He's the most important person in American politics for a decade now. He's likely to be the most consequential president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So in my mind, there's really no other answer.
Right, we live in the Trumpian era the same way we look back and say there was a Jacksonian era.
No, he's the dominant political figure of his time.
And cultural.
And cultural as well, just like Jackson was, as you say.
We have another question.
Our second question is, to what extent did the conservative legal movement developed together and or because in opposition to the conservative intellectual revolution with Bill Buckley and NR?
That's a very great question. I think it developed as a consequence. So when we talk about the conservative legal movement, we can kind of date it to the first meeting of the Federalist Society in 1982. And of course, there had been work done by Judge Bork and by Justice Scalia, by Alexander Bickel, by Raoul Berger. There were a variety of scholars who were trying to get back to the original meaning of the Constitution prior to that. But really, as we understand it, the conservative legal movement is a relatively recent historical phenomenon. I think it never felt itself in opposition to the conservative movement of Bill Buckley, but it developed kind of alongside it. And now, of course, I think it's one of the most effective branches of the conservative movement, as we can see in the way in which the courts have returned, in many instances, to an original understanding of the Constitution. It's hard these days because the headlines are filled with those pesky district court judges issuing national injunctions on the flimsiest of pretenses. But overall, there's no question that the conservative legal movement has been extremely effective over the last 40-some years.
So, and Charles, that might be the best example of actually building a counter-establishment where you're training, you're accrediting, you're getting in positions of influence.
No, that's right. And and one that was actually fairly welcomed even within the legal establishment. The law schools more or less opened their doors to the Federalist Society, which is not true, say, of the medical schools or other professional schools that have a very one-sided view of what public policy should be, what, I know my wife, Sally Pipes, is over here, who has started an organization called the Benjamin Rush Institute, which is an attempt to bring debate to medical schools as debate was brought to law schools against single payer and the sort of socialist equivalents today, Bernie Sanders kind of equivalents.
I was having a conversation with someone once, and I was saying, we need the equivalent of the Federalist Society in education and educational schools. And this guy said, Rich, but you need at least a conservative or two to start it in the educational schools, and there are none. So we just have a few minutes left. So Matt, let me start with you, and we'll get Charles' take on this as well. So what in your mind are the couple of things that we as conservatives can do to carry forth the best of Bill Buckley's ideas and legacy?
Sure. Well, I would say two things. When I look at the conservative movement today, I wish there was a higher prioritization of freedom. Conservatism changes over time. And even in the 1930s, when the leader of the conservative movement was Senator Taft of Ohio, Senator Taft believed in freedom. Everything was viewed through the lens of expanding the freedom of the individual, the freedom of the family to raise their children as they wish, the freedom of local communities to choose their own way. And the theme of freedom carries through the history of conservatism. And it's still present in the conservative movement. But I sometimes feel that it is sublimated, and more people spend time talking about strength and winning than human freedom. And so I think we always need to keep in mind as conservatives that as American conservatives who take our cues from the founding of this country, which was born in equal liberty for all, we need to stay true to the tradition of freedom. And then the other aspect that I want us all to continue to pay close attention to is truth. Bill Buckley was a believer in truth. He believed that there was right and wrong, there is good and evil, and there are transcendental standards of morality that we can judge what we see in front of our eyes. And so that sense of moral clarity is very important, whether we're talking about criminals on our streets or whether we're talking about adversaries abroad. So freedom and truth I think, are touchstones of the conservative movement that we still need to hew to, even in this very complicated and tumultuous world.
Charles.
Well, I would say, more or less in parallel to what Matt just said, debate and the Constitution. The way to truth is through debate, that is, critical inquiry. And even within, let us say, the conservative legal movement, which we were just talking about, there is and ought to be a vigorous debate about what originalism means, and there has been. I mean, it's more controversial than ever in a certain sense, even though I think more people are originalists in the judiciary than ever before. What exactly the meaning of originalism is more controversial than it was 30 years ago, or even in the 1920s when these discussions, you might say, began. Is there natural law in addition to positive law? And if so, how does natural law, or how ought it to inform constitutional interpretation? That's a major question, still is a wonderful question at many Federalist Society meetings and in many books that Randy Barnett and other scholars, Hadley Arkus and others, have been writing for the past generation or so. But I do think that the theme of constitutionalism is also crucial for conservatism. In order that we not slip into a value-free positivism or mere majoritarianism, we need to remind ourselves of the Constitution and the principles behind the Constitution that inform the Constitution, which you were adverting to in your remarks before this panel, the Declaration of Independence, and its assurance that all men are created equal. This is a statement of natural right or of natural justice, broadly speaking, and conservatives need not fear it or be allergic to it. We should endorse it, we should understand it, we should debate it, and we should fly that flag high and proud, I would say. And in a way, Mr. Trump has, this is one area where he has been less forthright than he should be. Trumpism should be identified with a defense of the Constitution against the liberal and progressive perversions of it. And the way this issue usually gets talked about in American politics, in the mainstream media and even beyond the mainstream media, Trump is putting the Constitution under pressure. You know, he's exerting executive authority against the Constitution.
Right. Well, the word you used I thought was so apt at the beginning. Velocity is colliding with a system that is meant to be bulky and create delays.
Yes.
So, but what argument do you make to people? We won this tremendous victory. There are all these things we wanted to do. A lot of them are getting done. We need to do more. There's a midterm coming. The Republicans probably lose. We need to do it fast. How do you make the case, well, the process is important and maybe delayed, and maybe some of the stuff you can't do? How do you make the case for that?
Well, I think the easiest defense is to say with Hamilton that energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. And an energetic executive, which may mean in certain issues
I think our executive is energetic.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that.
is defensible and is important. And remember also Hamilton says that a feeble execution is no execution at all. And having just lived through the presidency of a very feeble Joe Biden, we're reminded that the presidency and feeble execution don't go together well at all.
Well, and I also think it's a question of effectiveness. You think about the first Trump term and the first ban on immigration and even visiting from certain countries. When that ban was first proposed, it was struck down because it didn't follow the Administrative Procedures Act. And so the Trump administration lost time, lost effectiveness because it had to rewrite the ban. That was eventually put in place. But when Trump tried to change the census in his first term so that illegal immigrants were not included in congressional reapportionment, that lost too, because it wasn't done according to procedure. And had that been the case, had it gone through, had it been deliberate, then the Trump and Republican majority would be much larger now than it is otherwise. So I think you tell our friends, be deliberate, because that will be more effective, and that means that you can keep winning, which is what you like to talk about.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Matt and Charles. Thank you, gentlemen.